During World War II, Americans weren't just fighting overseas, they were fighting in their own kitchens. Sugar was scarce, meat was rationed, and butter almost disappeared from store shelves. But instead of going hungry, families got creative, sometimes in ways that seem almost unthinkable today. From pies made out of crackers, to onions stuffed with peanut butter, to donuts fried with mashed potatoes, every recipe was a symbol of survival, sacrifice, and ingenuity. What we might laugh at today was once the taste of victory for millions of Americans doing their part on the home front. These weren't just meals, they were memories, binding families together during blackouts, air raid drills, and war bond drives. They told children that even in hard times, something sweet or strange could still bring joy. In this documentary, we'll uncover 15 of the most bizarre survival recipes from World War II America. Dishes that fueled a nation under rationing, kept spirits high, and proved that even in the darkest days, Americans could still find a way to eat together. Righto, and we begin with perhaps the most unusual wartime dessert of all, a cake made with no sugar, no eggs, and no butter, and yet it carried the name of victory. Imagine celebrating a birthday or holiday without sugar, eggs, or butter, yet still putting a cake on the table. That was the reality of wartime America, and the solution was something called the victory cake. During World War II, sugar, eggs, and butter were tightly rationed. Housewives and home bakers had to stretch every ingredient and find clever substitutes. The government even published official pamphlets encouraging families to bake with alternatives like molasses, honey, corn syrup, or even mashed fruits. The result was the victory cake, a patriotic dessert meant to keep morale high while conserving precious resources for the troops overseas. Despite its unusual ingredient list, the victory cake was a staple at gatherings. It symbolized resilience, showing that even without luxuries, families could still mark birthdays, holidays, and Sunday dinners with something sweet. It wasn't just a dessert. It was a morale booster, proof that the home front could contribute to the war effort in its own way. What surprises many today is how proud Americans were of this sacrifice. Baking a cake without sugar wasn't seen as disappointing. It was seen as patriotic. Housewives would proudly serve their ration-friendly recipes, often decorated with slogans or small flags, as a reminder that even dessert was part of the fight for freedom. But cake wasn't the only thing transformed by rationing. Even one of America's favorite comfort foods, the donut, had to adapt in ways that might surprise you. When flour was scarce and sugar was rationed, Americans turned to an unlikely ingredient for their morning treat: mashed potatoes. By the early 1940s, wheat flour and sugar were tightly rationed across the United States. Housewives and bakers were encouraged to stretch recipes with whatever they had on hand. Potatoes, cheap and filling, became one of the most versatile substitutes. They could be mashed, mixed, or even used as a base for baked goods. Out of this creativity came the potato donut, a fried, sweetened cake where mashed potatoes replaced part of the flour and sugar. Potato donuts quickly became a favorite, not just because they stretched rations, but because they were surprisingly delicious. The potatoes kept the donuts soft, moist, and chewy longer than traditional recipes, a blessing when fresh food wasn't always available. Families could whip up a batch for Sunday mornings, or soldiers home on leave could enjoy a comforting taste of something sweet that didn't feel like deprivation. What shocks many today is just how widespread these became. Recipes for potato donuts appeared in newspapers, government cookbooks, and even on radio broadcasts. They weren't seen as a last resort recipe, but as a proud example of American ingenuity. For many families, a potato donut fried in leftover lard was not just breakfast. It was proof that you could make something joyful, even in the midst of scarcity. And if turning mashed potatoes into donuts sounds strange, just wait until you hear how ordinary soda crackers were transformed into a pie that fooled countless Americans. What if I told you that one of the most beloved wartime pies contained not a single slice of fruit, but soda crackers? During World War II, apples and other fresh fruits were often in short supply due to transportation restrictions and rationing. But pie was a cornerstone of American dining. No Sunday dinner or holiday table felt complete without one. To keep the tradition alive, clever cooks turned to mock recipes, and the most famous of all was mock apple pie. The dish used soda crackers, sugar substitutes, cinnamon, and lemon juice to create the illusion of apple filling. The crackers softened as they baked, absorbing the spice syrup until they mimicked the texture of baked apples. Mock apple pie wasn't just a trick of the kitchen. It was a morale saver. Families could still serve a pie that looked and tasted like the real thing, even when the real ingredients were nowhere to be found. Nabisco even published versions of the recipe right on Ritz cracker boxes, helping the dish become a wartime classic. For many children, it was the only apple pie they knew during those years. The shocking part? Many people swore they couldn't tell the difference. Soldiers returning home after the war joked that the pies they grew up eating had fooled them into thinking apples were always in the pantry. And for some families, mock apple pie lingered for years after the war, not out of necessity, but out of nostalgia. It wasn't just pie. It was a taste of resilience. But while some recipes tried to imitate old favorites, others took bold turns with entirely new flavors, like a sweet onion stuffed with peanut butter. Of all the strange dishes to come out of World War II, few raise eyebrows quite like peanut butter stuffed onions, a recipe that sounds more like a dare than dinner. During World War II, rationing meant families had to find new ways to get protein without relying on scarce and expensive meats. Peanut butter became a household hero, cheap, filling, and full of protein. Onions, on the other hand, were one of the few vegetables that were both affordable and widely available year-round. Home economists, tasked with helping families stretch their rations, began publishing recipes that paired the two together. The method was simple: hollow out onions, fill the centers with peanut butter, and bake until soft. The dish was promoted as a nutritious, low-cost alternative to meat-based meals. As odd as it may sound, the dish had a certain logic. It was high in protein, inexpensive, and could be prepared with ingredients that weren't heavily rationed. Families struggling to put food on the table could serve peanut butter stuffed onions as a main course, giving the illusion of a hearty dish when traditional proteins were out of reach. It was the kind of recipe that reflected the resourcefulness of wartime America, where necessity often drove creativity. What's shocking is that this recipe wasn't hidden in the back pages of obscure cookbooks. It was widely shared in wartime pamphlets and homemaking magazines. For some children of the 1940s, this wasn't a joke, it was dinner. While many likely wrinkled their noses, others came to accept it as normal. To families on the home front, peanut butter stuffed onions weren't about flavor. They were about survival, resilience, and the memory of making do when times were tough. And if peanut butter onions weren't strange enough, some wartime cooks turned to even more creative substitutes, like pies made without a single piece of fruit. When oranges were scarce and citrus nearly vanished from American shelves, families found a surprising stand-in: the humble carrot. During World War II, imported fruits like oranges, lemons, and grapefruits became difficult to source in America due to shipping shortages and military prioritization. Yet, marmalade and citrus preserves were beloved breakfast staples. To solve this, cooks turned to carrots, abundant, cheap, and naturally sweet. By grating carrots and cooking them down with lemon or orange essence, they could mimic the color, texture, and even some of the flavor of traditional marmalade. Government pamphlets encouraged the recipe as a thrifty alternative, and many families proudly spread carrot marmalade on their morning toast. Carrot marmalade wasn't just about flavor. It was about preserving normalcy. Children could still wake up to something bright and sweet on bread, reminding them of the life they had before rationing. It was also highly practical. Carrots were packed with vitamins, especially beta-carotene, which wartime propaganda even claimed helped soldiers see better at night. Families felt they were not just making do, but contributing to the war effort by staying strong and healthy. The twist? Some people actually preferred carrot marmalade to the real thing. Its sweetness, bright orange color, and spreadable texture made it a nostalgic favorite long after the war. For children who grew up during rationing, the taste of carrot marmalade often became forever tied to memories of resilience, wartime kitchens, and the comforting voice of mothers doing their best with what they had. And carrots weren't the only unexpected ingredient that took center stage. Even gelatin desserts found strange new wartime twists. Jell-O may remind us of colorful birthday parties or Sunday potlucks, but during World War II, gelatin desserts took on some truly bizarre twists. Gelatin was cheap, versatile, and not heavily rationed during the war, so it became a blank canvas for cooks working with limited ingredients. Wartime homemakers mixed gelatin with whatever they had on hand: canned vegetables, leftover meats, or scraps of fruit. Dishes like vegetable gelatin loaf or savory tomato jello appeared in newspapers and cookbooks, marketed as both practical and patriotic. These creations were often served as side dishes at dinner tables or even brought to church suppers when meat was scarce. For families, gelatin recipes stretched limited supplies, preserved leftovers, and created dishes that felt substantial. A wobbly loaf filled with carrots, celery, or even tuna might sound odd today, but back then, it looked festive and resourceful. Plus, gelatin dishes didn't require much sugar or flour, two of the most tightly rationed ingredients of the war. The twist? Not all of these recipes were beloved. Many children and soldiers groaned at the sight of green Jell-O filled with cabbage or onions. Yet, families still served them proudly because they represented survival and creativity. For some, the memory of wartime gelatin, no matter how strange, became a symbol of how Americans could make even the strangest meals feel like a celebration. But gelatin wasn't the only way Americans tried to make meals stretch. Sometimes survival meant going back to basics, like frying up cakes made from cornmeal and water. When flour was rationed and bread was scarce, Americans turned to one of the oldest staples in their kitchens, cornmeal. Historical background/context. Cornmeal had long been a foundation of American cooking, especially in the South, where cornbread, grits, and hush puppies were household favorites. During World War II, with wheat flour strictly rationed, cornmeal became an essential substitute. Families created simple cornmeal cakes, flat, fried patties made from cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt. Some recipes added drippings, molasses, or even bits of leftover vegetables, but at their heart, these cakes were about survival. Why it mattered or was popular. Cornmeal cakes filled bellies when bread was hard to come by. They were quick to make, inexpensive, and versatile. Eaten for breakfast with syrup, at dinner as a side, or even in lunch pails for workers in factories supporting the war effort. They connected families to older American traditions of making do, stretching back to colonial kitchens and pioneer campsites. Emotional or shocking twist. The twist is how emotionally tied people became to them. For many children who grew up during the war, cornmeal cakes weren't seen as a hardship food, but as comfort. Served hot from the skillet with a drizzle of sorghum or honey, they reminded families that even in times of rationing, there could still be warmth and abundance at the table. Some veterans later admitted they preferred these simple cakes to the bread that returned after the war. Smooth transition to next point. But while cornmeal cakes gave families comfort, other recipes were far stranger, like turning mashed beans into fudge. What if I told you that one of America's sweetest wartime treats was made from mashed beans? Historical background/context. During World War II, chocolate, sugar, and dairy were all tightly rationed, making traditional candy and desserts difficult to prepare. To fill the gap, resourceful homemakers experimented with beans, cheap, filling, and available in every pantry. White beans, such as Navy or Great Northern, were cooked, mashed, and blended with sugar substitutes, cocoa powder, and a bit of fat to create a dense, chewy fudge-like dessert. Recipes for bean fudge appeared in ration cookbooks and women's magazines, advertised as a clever way to keep treats on the table when real chocolate was out of reach. Why it mattered or was popular. Bean fudge mattered because it provided a little indulgence in a time of sacrifice. For children, it was often the only form of candy they could expect at home. It also aligned with government messaging. Beans were high in protein and considered patriotic food since they replaced scarce meats. By disguising beans in a sweet treat, mothers were not just feeding their families, they were keeping morale alive. Emotional or shocking twist. The shocking part is that many kids had no idea they were eating beans. Parents kept the ingredient a secret, passing it off as fudge, and children grew up associating it with wartime birthdays or holidays. Some swore it tasted just like the real thing, while others never forgave the trick fudge of their childhoods. Either way, bean fudge became a memory that defined what sacrifice and ingenuity tasted like on the home front. Smooth transition to next point. Of course, not every substitution tried to be sweet. Some recipes focused on heartiness and survival, like stretching a single can of meat into an entire meal with vegetables and flour. When meat was rationed and families had to make a single pound of beef feed 6 people, meatloaf became more than a dinner. It became a symbol of wartime survival. Historical background/context. During World War II, meat was one of the most heavily rationed foods in America. Housewives were given ration stamps that allowed them to buy only limited amounts of beef, pork, or chicken each week. To stretch what little they had, recipes for meatloaf stretchers became wildly popular. Cooks blended ground beef with oats, breadcrumbs, rice, or even grated vegetables to bulk up the loaf. Some recipes even replaced half the meat with mashed beans or potatoes. Why it mattered or was popular. Meatloaf stretchers gave families the sense of having a hearty, filling meal, even when the actual meat content was minimal. Served with a little gravy or ketchup on top, it still felt like a main course worthy of the dinner table. For children, it provided familiarity, something that resembled the pre-war meals they knew. And for mothers, it was proof that they could make ration coupons stretch without leaving their families hungry. Emotional or shocking twist. The twist is that these recipes didn't fade away after the war. They became part of American cuisine. Stretching a meat loaf with oats or breadcrumbs wasn't just a rationing trick. It became a tradition, passed down for decades. What began as a necessity in the 1940s turned into comfort food for generations, long after ration books were tucked away. Smooth transition to next point. But not every wartime recipe had staying power. Some were so strange they faded away quickly, like the unusual pairing of cabbage and gelatin. Imagine sitting down at the dinner table and being served a wobbly green gelatin mold filled with shredded cabbage. Historical background/context. During World War II, gelatin became a kitchen staple because it was inexpensive, easy to store, and not heavily rationed. Families experimented with using it to hold together scraps of vegetables, meats, or fruits. One of the strangest results was the cabbage gelatin salad, a molded dish made with lime or lemon gelatin, vinegar, shredded cabbage, and sometimes even onions or carrots. These salads often appeared in cookbooks and wartime pamphlets, promoted as a thrifty way to create something that looked substantial and decorative for the family table. Why it mattered or was popular. For families, gelatin salads offered a way to stretch ingredients and give leftovers a second life. They were cheap, filling, and presented as a modern way of cooking, thanks to the popularity of molded foods in the 1930s and 40s. A cabbage gelatin mold at a church supper or dinner table showed both thrift and creativity. Emotional or shocking twist. The shocking part? Many people hated them. Children dreaded the sight of a quivering, tangy, cabbage-filled gelatin, and even adults sometimes admitted it was more novelty than nourishment. Yet these salads kept appearing, not because they were beloved, but because they reflected the necessity of the times. For many who grew up in the 1940s, the memory of cabbage gelatin is one they'd rather forget, but it's also a reminder of what survival looked like on the home front. Smooth transition to next point. But while cabbage and gelatin may sound unappetizing, some wartime recipes managed to turn scarcity into comfort, like a warm bowl of bread pudding made from scraps. In a time when nothing could be wasted, even stale bread was transformed into a dessert that warmed American homes. Historical background/context. Bread was rationed during the war, and families couldn't afford to throw away a single crust. Enter bread pudding, a dish with deep roots in frugal kitchens long before the 1940s. Wartime versions made use of every scrap of bread, soaked in milk or watered-down cream, sweetened with ration-friendly alternatives like molasses, honey, or corn syrup, and flavored with a pinch of cinnamon if available. It was then baked into a dense, custard-like dessert. Sometimes raisins or fruit scraps were added, but often it was simply bread, sugar substitute, and milk. Why it mattered or was popular. Wartime bread pudding wasn't just about dessert, it was about comfort. Families could still gather at the table and share something sweet after supper, even when sugar and eggs were scarce. For children, it was often the highlight of the week, and for mothers, it was proof that they could provide a treat without wasting a crumb. Bread pudding carried the message that nothing went unused, and even the simplest scraps could become something worth savoring. Emotional or shocking twist. The twist? For many who grew up during the war, bread pudding became a symbol of love and resilience. Children didn't see it as a poverty dish, but as a cherished memory, one tied to the smell of cinnamon in the oven or the warmth of family in hard times. To this day, some families still pass down wartime bread pudding recipes, not because they had to anymore, but because it reminded them of a time when every bite was treasured. Smooth transition to next point. But dessert wasn't the only place scraps found new life. Even coffee, a soldier's staple, was stretched with some shocking substitutes. For many Americans, a morning without coffee was unthinkable, until the war forced them to find creative and sometimes questionable replacements. Historical background/context. Coffee was one of the most heavily rationed items during World War II. Supplies were diverted overseas to feed the troops, leaving civilians back home with only a fraction of what they were used to. The government encouraged stretching or substituting coffee, leading to some unusual brews. Families roasted chicory root, barley, wheat, acorns, or even ground-up soybeans to create a hot drink that mimicked the bitterness of coffee. Some mixed a tiny spoonful of real coffee with these fillers to keep the taste alive just a little longer. Why it mattered or was popular. Coffee wasn't just about caffeine, it was about morale. Housewives needed it to start their day, workers drank it on break, and soldiers wrote home about how much they missed a real cup. The substitutes kept a comforting ritual alive, even if the flavor was a far cry from the real thing. In fact, chicory coffee became so common in some parts of the country that it remained popular even after the war ended. Emotional or shocking twist. The twist. Many of these substitutes were barely drinkable. Veterans remembered coming home to coffee that tasted like scorched grain, yet families endured it with a smile. Some even claimed that acorn coffee gave them more stomach aches than energy. Still, for many Americans, sipping those improvised brews was an act of patriotism, a reminder that sacrifice happened not only on the battlefield, but at the breakfast table too. Smooth transition to next point. And speaking of sacrifices, even America's beloved meats weren't spared. The next recipe shows just how creative families became with every ounce of protein they had. Imagine craving a sweet dessert, only to find sugar, fruit, and butter scarce. The solution? A pie flavored with vinegar. Historical background/context. During World War II, luxuries like sugar, lemons, and other fruits were rationed or simply unavailable. Families who still wanted a slice of pie after dinner turned to creative substitutes. Vinegar pie, also known as desperation pie, had been around since the 1800s but experienced a revival during the 1940s. Vinegar provided the tang and brightness that lemons normally offered, while basic pantry staples like flour, sugar, and eggs filled out the recipe. Why it mattered or was popular? Vinegar pie mattered because it allowed families to preserve a cherished ritual, dessert. Even if it didn't taste exactly like lemon meringue or apple pie, it kept spirit high at a time when morale was just as important as nutrition. Children often didn't even realize they were eating vinegar. The flavor was softened with spices like nutmeg or cinnamon. For many, it was proof that resourcefulness could still deliver sweetness in lean times. Emotional or shocking twist. The shocking twist is that vinegar pie was more than a substitute. It became a treasured family memory. Soldiers returning from war later recall how their mothers or grandmothers served vinegar pie during those years, and some even requested the recipe when food shortages ended. What began as a dish of necessity often lingered as a reminder of resilience, frugality, and the creativity of home kitchens during crisis. Smooth transition to next point. And while vinegar pie found a way to sweeten the table, other recipes went in the opposite direction, stretching salt and protein in the most unusual ways, like peanut butter stuffed onions. It may sound like a prank recipe, but in wartime America, peanut butter stuffed onions were a very real dish, and families actually served it proudly at the dinner table. Historical background/context. During World War II, onions were widely available and inexpensive, while peanut butter was a protein-rich staple that didn't require refrigeration. With meat heavily rationed, families had to get creative with protein substitutes. Cookbooks distributed by the U.S. government and homemaker magazines suggested combinations that seem odd by today's standards. One such recipe involved hollowing out onions, stuffing them with peanut butter, and then baking them until soft. The result was a savory sweet dish meant to stretch both nutrition and imagination. Why it mattered or was popular? This strange pairing mattered because it addressed two major wartime concerns: nutrition and frugality. Peanut butter provided protein and healthy fats, while onions offered bulk and flavor without taking away from precious rations. Families who were used to hearty meat-based meals found comfort in dishes that felt substantial, even if they tasted unusual. Peanut butter stuffed onions may not have been gourmet, but they symbolized the ability to make do with what was on hand. Emotional or shocking twist. The shocking part is that this wasn't a joke recipe tucked away in obscurity. It was recommended in earnest, appearing in pamphlets designed to help homemakers survive rationing. While many children at the time reportedly turned up their noses, some families developed a real fondness for the dish. For them, it wasn't just survival food, It was a quirky symbol of unity, resilience, and finding satisfaction even when choices were limited. Smooth transition to outro. From peanut butter onions to potato peel bread. These wartime recipes remind us just how inventive Americans became when survival meant turning the simplest foods into entire meals. When we look back at these bizarre survival recipes, it's easy to laugh at the thought of peanut butter onions or prune pie. But for millions of American families, these meals weren't just food. They were a lifeline. They tell the story of a nation that refused to give up, even when the pantry was bare and the future uncertain. Every onion stuffed, every potato peel boiled, every creative substitution was more than just cooking. It was resilience in action. These recipes remind us that history isn't only about battles fought overseas. It's also about the quiet victories won at kitchen tables across America. So the next time you open your refrigerator, take a moment to imagine the sacrifices and ingenuity that came before. Food isn't just about taste, it's about survival, culture, and the stories we pass down. If you enjoyed this journey through history's strangest recipes, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves nostalgia, and subscribe to our channel for more stories from the America we remember. Until next time, keep the memories alive, one forgotten recipe at a time.